Good morning, welcome to the Point. You don't have to go far to find the partisan divide in this country. Just talk about the impeachment inquiry. Talking to our congressional delegation this week, it seemed to depend if there was an R or a D after their name as to how they felt about that, and we'll hear from them later in this segment. But there is another developing story that has a more bipartisan approach, it would appear, and that is the pulling of troops from Syria. We sat down at a local Muskegon restaurant with Congressman Bill Huizenga to talk about that and more. Congressman, let's talk about a major change in U.S. foreign policy as it regards our presence in Syria and our relationship with the Kurds. This is something that happened pretty quickly, and as quickly as that change happened, so did the status with Turkey and Syria. A lot of people are very concerned about what this means for the region, but even more concerned about what it may mean for our relationships with other countries and our reliability as a partner. Give me your take from what you know from the Capitol Hill standpoint.
Yeah, well, count me in on that list of concerned. I was expressing this back during the last administration that we had phantom red lines and people couldn't count on us. I called for, at the time, arming the Kurds directly, both in Iraq and in Syria. And people have to understand there's a difference between the Turkish PKK Kurds and Kurds that are in that other band, that other area of Syria and Iraq. And the one thing that is uniting them, frankly, is opposition to Turkey right now. And then you've got some folks, in fact, I had gotten a communique from the Kurdistan government. They have like a shadow government. Last evening and this week, they've been sending out emails to lawmakers, and in there it said, look, there is a real possibility of us getting forced to going into basically the arms of the Assad regime and the Russians by extension, just to battle back against the Turks, and that is not a situation where we want to be in.
Well, and it's further complicated because Turkey is a UN member. Or as a NATO member, and
Article 5.
So that's also part of the complexity for the United States government, right?
Absolutely. Article 5 of NATO says that if any of the NATO countries are attacked, we are compelled. If they choose to invoke that Article 5 request, we by treaty are required to respond and to help. The only time last time Article 5 was invoked was 9/11, and we had our NATO allies basically put on alert as well. And so there's real consequences in this. And the Kurds are a complicated part and piece of the Middle East. But it's the Middle East. It's all complicated, and there's lots of varying puzzle pieces that we got to put together. I just don't understand why we're pulling out so dramatically and leaving this vacuum.
Well, it is a conversation that seems to have no resolution. First of all, we're not going to solve the problems of the Middle East. I think we've proven that over the past however many decades. But we have been, in the eyes of some, from time to time, a stabilizing force, or a force at least that was one that could be counted on and was recognized for whatever purpose the United States government served in that region. Does this now say to others in the region that we may have supported in the past that we're simply not going to be reliable, and that what's happened there in Syria could happen in other countries as well?
Yeah, I think it does. And look, that was part of the criticism that the last administration, the Obama administration, had as well, as they were in such a rush to pull troops out that they were creating that vacuum, and that's where these phantom red lines were created, and then sort of launch, maybe not launch missiles and all kinds of confusing things. And look, there needs to be some predictability to those alliances, and I understand Turkey as part of NATO is an important alliance, but so are the Kurds vis-a-vis what has been happening not just in Syria but against ISIS. and in other countries in that region. And personally, I believe the Kurds ought to have an autonomous homeland. That is something that I think makes sense. I think they ought to get armed directly. That to me makes sense as well. And frankly, again, nobody has been a better ally in fighting ISIS in that region than the Kurds.
Well, I guess the final question then on this, and as you were describing this situation, thinking about that Article 5, if, and we presume that won't happen, but if that happened, we would be in the unenviable situation of perhaps putting our armed forces against people that they had previously trained. Mm-hmm. And so that just shows you how complex that region is.
Not to mention it becomes a proxy war potentially with Russia, because you've got Syria and Russia are joined at the hip. The Assad regime is in existence because of Russia. And then if you have the Kurds link up, and this is the enemy of my enemy is my friend situation, right? I mean, this is not where they want to go, but if their alternative is Turkey occupying that territory, they very well may go with the Assad regime. At which point, then you've got Turkey and NATO allies versus Kurds, who we, as you point out, had previously trained as part of the Free Syrian Defense Army, and the Assad regime now linked up with Russia, and that just adds more fuel to the fire.
Does Congress have a role in dealing with the administration with this issue, or is this largely something that is going to be driven from 1600 Pennsylvania?
It's going to be driven a lot by 1600, but Pennsylvania Avenue. But we definitely have to have a response. I believe you find if there has been a unifying force in Congress right now, frankly, it's this. You've seen conservatives, liberals, moderates of all stripe. Everyone has, from various camps around the Capitol, have come and said, hey, this is the wrong direction to go. House and Senate as well. So I think you're going to see a lot of pressure from the Senate. And then pressure from the House as well, and how do we compel funding? That might be different debate as we're moving into some of the funding deadlines that we have here. We go end of November, where we've got the continuing resolution running out. So my guess is you're going to have a lot of discussion surrounding that, and with some pressure coming on the funding.
Well, let's talk about that continuing resolution. Let's talk about the attitude in Washington as it pertains to. We just talked about the second most talked about issue. The first most talked about issue is the impeachment inquiry and how that impacts you and what has to happen in Congress, because you still do have responsibilities and things
yes,
that have to happen.
People forget that, yes.
But talk about the impeachment inquiry, because that is really taking up a lot of the oxygen in the room. What does that do on the Hill? What does it do to members?
Yeah, well, I have the burden of actually now this being my second impeachment process professionally that I've lived through. You know, my first back in the late '90s, I was district director for Pete Hoekstra at the time, and I saw it from that staff side, policy side, how much oxygen was sucked out of the room, where it became the issue. It became the issue where protests that were out in front of Pete's office, and phone calls and emails that were coming in, and the communication that dominated it from constituents. Then when the Starr report actually came out, by the way, showed definitively that the president had committed perjury in front of a grand jury. That then turned it into another chapter of what was going on, and at the time it just didn't allow Congress to act in a way that really covered the bases. It did the bare minimum, and it didn't go after some of those larger issues that needed to be tackled. Well, those larger issues that need to be tackled today, now that we have this foreign policy side, that certainly is one of them. But we've got immigration, we've got health care, we've got USMCA. And that is really problematic as we are trying to move forward in a policy footing. When I think the dominant issue, whether it's on talk radio, cable news channels, or even in and among the offices, is going to be impeachment.
Well, as this process moves forward, we don't know exactly how it's going to move forward because you have multiple jurisdictions, different committees looking.
Including my own financial services.
So as each of these committees makes their way through whatever information that they can find and whatever determination is made about whether articles of impeachment should be drawn up and if they should be voted on, do we have any idea of what kind of a time frame we're looking at? Because the Starr report, I mean, that went on for years. In that investigation, and then the process itself took a fair amount of time. We are 13 months out of the next general election. Is it reasonable to assume that any of this could be completed, whatever the completion is, whatever the conclusion is, could be done before then?
Well, if we took precedence and the way things had been done previously, looking back at the Clinton impeachment and then looking back at the Nixon impeachment process that had gone on, we're outside the bounds of what that process had been.
And that's primarily because you haven't taken the vote to affirm the beginning of the inquiry, which is, I should point out, not required.
No, the Constitution is quiet on a lot of things. All it says is the House will be in charge of the impeachment. That's basically all it says. House procedure had been put in place because they realized that they needed some predictability and that there needed to be a process. Nancy Pelosi has made the decision to chuck that all out the window. So is there a legal requirement? No. But neither is there a legal requirement for cooperation into something that isn't an official inquiry. So it seems to me that if this is where they're going, and I just mentioned, the Financial Services Committee has now been put on notice that we may be a part of this impeachment inquiry. On what? We don't know. What are the rules of engagement on the committee? Who's going to be coming? Who's going to be calling witnesses? How are we going to be meeting these witnesses? In public and forum, or are we going to have behind closed doors? What about the minority? What are we going to have the ability to pull in witnesses? There's all kinds of questions that Nancy Pelosi is just kind of making it up as she's moving along. So my point to that, and to I think the answer to your question is, the more it's getting sort of made up ad hoc, the less predictable it is in figuring out where and how and when, more importantly, this comes to an end. Because I think they're just making it up as they're going along.
Is it your assumption, and maybe you don't want to assume, do you believe that there are 218 votes to proceed if she called such a vote, and not knowing if any articles of impeachment are going to come forward, but is it your supposition there would be 218 votes for that?
Yeah, I think there probably would be. As of earlier this week, there was only 8 holdouts, and there was another guy named Max Rose from Staten Island who said he is now in favor of moving forward and in favor of impeachment. And people are trying to split hairs. Are they for the inquiry, but maybe not for impeachment yet? Well, let's clarify that. So I don't doubt. You never know.
Right.
I think my guess would be that there would be enough votes to move forward with it. But it's not just the initiation of it. It's what are the rules of engagement in this? That really is the important part, because we cannot have a process be viewed by the American people as legitimate if there are not some basic rules of engagement, rules of protecting minority rights, and I mean that of the Republicans. I think the rights of the accused. There has to be some understanding of what this is going to look like moving forward, and when they're making it up as they go along and just sort of, it's Judiciary Committee, which, by the way, is where it traditionally has always resided as the lead committee. Well, maybe Nadler wasn't going in the right direction, or maybe he wasn't moving fast enough, or maybe it wasn't quite the message that we wanted. So, hey, by the way, Chairman Schiff, why don't you do this now over here on the Intel Committee, which has never been the place to go forward with an impeachment inquiry. So I think they're. Again, having the history of this and looking at this from 20 plus years ago, the mistake that I think Nancy Pelosi is allowing herself to stumble into is the backlash that could be coming, and I think that's why she had been so reticent to move forward, and I think that's why she's reticent to move forward even with the vote to formally kick off an inquiry, is she knows that the Republicans paid a steep political price after they impeached Bill Clinton and failed to remove him from office in the Senate. And maybe that's the second part of your question earlier. Are there the votes to move forward with impeachment? Certainly the inquiry, yes. We have to see whether there is votes to actually impeach the president. Are there 67 votes to remove the president in the U.S. Senate? I don't even think there's anything close to that.
Well, you've got to move 20 Republican senators, and maybe a handful, but that also is dependent on what develops, because there was a time when it was impossible to think there were enough votes in the Senate to remove Richard Nixon, and at the end of the day, that process stopped because he believed there were. Yeah. And so that was over a long time.
He believed they were, and he also, I think, to his credit, and this was the debate back during the Clinton administration. Indications are both, we know what he said publicly, but the indications were what he said privately as well, is he was afraid it was going to damage the presidency itself. And if you read any of those books on Ford and sort of that strange purgatory that Gerald Ford was in, there really was a concern for the institution of the presidency, the constitutional standing of it. That kind of went out the window with the Bill Clinton impeachment when he made the decision he was going to move ahead no matter what. And I think we're living with the echo effect of that today.
While our conversation will continue with Congressman Huizenga after the break, before we get there, we talked to other members of our congressional delegation this week about impeachment and the inquiry that's going on right now. You'll hear from Senator Peters, Senator Stabenow, and Congressman Molinar.
This should be bipartisan. This is a very, very serious situation. If you look at the facts as we know them now from the transcript, we know the president engaged in a direct conversation with the Ukrainian president, asked for a favor to be engaged in the election, in digging up dirt on his political opponent. This is something that a president of the United States should never do, regardless of what party that they are in. And yet my Republican colleagues are silent.
Talk to me from the standpoint of what, if anything, the Senate is doing. Obviously, it's a House operation until you get going, but I mean, you obviously have discussed it, I would guess.
Well, we're certainly discussing and following it. Nothing happens in the Senate until the House acts, but it is very clear that the president used the reputation and the funding of the United States of America, funds that we pass on a bipartisan basis to support Ukraine to protect themselves from Russia, and the president decided to hold that over their heads unless they dug up dirt on a political opponent, and so that's wrong.
This process will go forward. I believe they do have the votes on the Democratic side to do an impeachment in the House. I think it's important that we take the vote, move forward. Ultimately, there's a lot of legislation that is resting on us getting something done in Congress. You know, there's the trade policy, the new Mexico-Canada trade agreement, the SULAC, something we've been working very hard on. We want to get this work done, and the impeachment is really holding up some of the progress on that.
When we come back, we'll talk trade and the Great Lakes with Congressman Bill Huizenga next. To the Point. Welcome back to the Point. Earlier, we sat down and talked with Congressman Bill Huizenga about a number of issues, including Great Lakes. You'll hear about that later in this segment. But first, what about a trade deal? Let's move on to one of the things you mentioned that you feel like needs to be done. And it's another question about votes, because your leader, Leader McCarthy, told me recently that he believed if USMCA came to the floor that there were enough votes to pass it, but it wasn't going to come to the floor, at least not anytime soon. Yeah. Talk about what that is. It's the replacement for NAFTA. Yeah. Talk about why you think it's a good idea, if I assume that you do, and what the prospects are on getting any action. Yeah.
Well, first and foremost, I believe that NAFTA did need to be revisited. There was no mechanism to revisit it, and so in as much heartburn as it gave a lot of people, especially in manufacturing and agriculture and other things that are very tied here to Michigan, most of them look at the outcome and go, you know what? This looks like we're in a better place. And specifically for those two, agriculture, we have opened up markets that traditionally had not been as open, dairy being one specific item of that. Manufacturing here in Michigan, it's cars and car parts, right? Not to mention office furniture, but let's look at the vehicles. Increasing the U.S. content in North American vehicles and the requirement for that, how is that not a win? And I don't see how you would have a more pro-labor government in Canada, a more pro-labor union government in Mexico than what currently exists with Justin Trudeau and Obrador, the new president in Mexico. And arguably, this is by far the most pro-union Republican president that the U.S. has seen probably since Eisenhower. Maybe Nixon, who had some ties in with a number of the labor unions as well. So it seems to me the time is ripe for this. And again, the trading partnership that we have, U.S. and Canada, the largest trading partnership in the world. The state of Michigan and Canada is something like the 7th or 8th largest trading partnership in the entire world. And then you add that all in with Mexico as well. We need that heft to go up against a China or to go up against a unified Europe. Now they've got their own issues with Great Britain right now, but this really needs to come. I think it would pass, but earlier this week, Richard Trumka, head of the AFL-CIO, came out opposed to it and said we shouldn't have a vote before Thanksgiving. And his reasoning was that it wasn't tough enough on some of the labor standards, which I think is off. It feels like that goal line has been moved a bit on the administration. What I'm afraid, Rick, is that it's really about not giving this administration a policy win of any sort. And there are certainly elements of both the grassroots as well as the infrastructure that surrounds Washington, including labor unions and others, that look at this and say, well, it might be okay for our workers, it might even be an improvement for our workers, but man, we really want Donald Trump out, so why would we give him a win?
Quickly, because we're out of time, Great Lakes Restoration Initiative is something that has been in place and is, I know Senator Stabenow has some plans, as do you in the House, to beef that up a little bit. The reason I mentioned the senator is because this is one of those things you can point to as a bipartisan effort, a multi-state jurisdictional with members from Democrats and Republicans from a lot of Great Lakes states that are working on this. So where are we with that? And talk a little bit about what the future is.
Yeah, so we have gotten the administration to fully support that $300 million a year. Here's why I believe we can show that is deserved to even go higher is results, and that needs to be the threshold. And as long as we can continue to show results and a proper use of those tax dollars, we need to fund it. We have done that. We have seen this in West Michigan, certainly with PFAS and what's going on there, with what's been happening with invasive species and a number of other things. There's some real success stories. And we also know that there is some real issues that are going to be tackled and need to be tackled that this type of program can support. So I think we're going to be able to get there through the appropriations process to maybe even see an increase in that $300 million.
Most everything, it seems, has some type of political overtone in Washington, but when it comes to the Great Lakes, at least there is bipartisan cooperation there among those members who represent Great Lakes states. And it looks like that increased funding could come around sometime this fall. We'll continue to follow that, and we'll be back with a final note next. To the point. With developments changing rapidly in Syria and on the impeachment front, some of what we talked about this morning is likely to be dated. It's one of the problems in trying to keep up with the fast-moving news cycle that now exists in Washington, D.C. But we will continue to follow those issues as well as keep you updated on Michigan's state budget, because there could be movement there, but it will still take an agreement between the governor and the legislature, and so far that hasn't happened. Each Sunday morning at 10 o'clock, we get together right here to talk about an abundance of news that happens in the political world. I hope you'll join us next and every Sunday right here for To the Point.